encapsulated in the original parable of the Good Samaritan, which is that, as you will recall, the parable originates. There's this sort of Jesus Christ is discussing with a group of people the question, a very basic question of how do I enter the kingdom of heaven, a pretty important question. And his answer is love thy neighbour. And now there is a lawyer present. It's a group of lawyers he's actually talking to, and the lawyer says, well, who is my neighbour? And then the parable is offered, which is to say that your neighbour isn't simply the person who belongs to your community or is perceived to be, but your neighbour is somebody from outside the community, for example, the Samaritan. And so one of the great organising principles or so we like to think, of how we try and organise community and try and sort of do the right thing when we get out of bed in the morning, has been this business of trying to help our neighbours as best we can. Has that been a successful enterprise? History would suggest it hasn't. But in Dubai, it's very different. In Dubai, you have geographic proximity, but you don't have the sense of the neighbour. So what you have instead is this. For example, the neighbour principle has been adopted by the law of negligence. I was a lawyer for years, and so if you drive your car carelessly and you injure somebody, you have to compensate that person for the injury because this person is deemed to be your neighbour, and you've hurt your neighbour. You owe him a duty of care. But if I drive in Dubai and I have a car accident, the outcome, the legal consequences are not they don't investigate who was driving carefully or who was paying attention. No, the first thing they ask themselves is who is involved in the car accident. If it's a local person, then that person has no liability. So, and likewise, if amongst the expat community, you have this hierarchy of the kind of whites, essentially, and not just whites, but also kind of Europeans, basically, of every kind of ethnicity. And then you have Westerners of every ethnicity, and then you have Easterners who work on the construction sites and are mainly from kind of South Asia, India, and who are the lowest of the low, and who have barely any rights, and whose passports are taken away from them, as soon as they arrive in the country, and and who obviously are not protected by any idea of love thy neighbour, and at the same time, so that's all. It's also a very dramatic kind of new society which kind of makes no bones about what it's up to.
Okay, and just to pursue perhaps the comparisons or contrasts people might want to draw between The Dog and your earlier novels. One thing that struck me when I reread this, with you coming, was the way in which really in all of your novel-length books, at the core of the story is a relationship between two men. And that's true of your memoir as well, with the two grandfathers who never meet, but their stories are closely intertwined with you mediating between them. What do you think about that? Is that a pattern you're conscious of?
Yeah, it is a pattern I'm conscious of. I sort of think I'm stuck with it. Well, usually what happens is I usually think, oh, this would be an interesting person to write about. And then I never end up having that person writing the story. I always have another person writing the story, because there's something boring about interesting things in my mind. And then in the end it becomes the story of the storyteller. I don't know what to say. I mean, it is. I do think typically writers do. I think writers typically do, with notable exceptions, Tolstoy, Norman Rush. They do tend to stick to their own gender, simply because, to write something good. If you want to write, I could write I think I could write a novel from a woman's point of view. It would be very difficult for me, but I'm not certain that it would. That I wouldn't be guilty of writing with empathy.
Okay, but the character of Jen, the wife and the dog, who we see in glimpses, she's a horror, really, isn't she?
Well, I mean, we only see it from his point of view. You know, that's the thing. We only see it from his point of view. We don't see it from her point of view. And this narrator is no picnic in some ways. I mean, he's not. He's a sort of. He's slightly infuriating sometimes. So that would make sense in this case. It does make sense. But I mean, a lot of the male characters are pretty horrible as well. So everybody in this novel is pretty dubious. But the one thing I want to say about Dubai before we leave the subject is, not that we will, but while it's on my mind, is that it's not uncommon for Western media to sort of point the finger at Dubai and shout at it and say, look what a terrible place it is. But I worry about that a little bit because, you know, if you look at a city like London or even Dublin, it's just built on the backs of thousands of unpaid labourers and deaths and misery, colonialism, which just happened to have taken place 100 years ago. The misfortune of Dubai is that they're going through their phase of oppressive nation building right now in front of the social media, but it's nothing compared to the sort of suffering inflicted around the world by the United Arab Emirates. Is sort of nothing compared to the sort of stuff which the privileges which more kind of so-called advanced Western societies have enjoyed. Okay,
just one more question before I ask the audience if they'd like to ask you anything. When you named your character X in the dog, and you know that's the first letter of his name. Did you have a name in mind?
I didn't. But I do now.
And what is it?
I'm not going to tell you.
There aren't that many Zans,
you're still not on it. It's not Zan and it's not Xavier. Keep going.
I'm going to lie awake tonight thinking about this. I know.
You could actually figure it out, I think.
Okay, give me some time. So do we have questions for Joe either about the dog or about his other fiction or his memoir? I'm sure that we do.
Can I ask a question? I love the voice. I thought the voice was so funny. I mean, he's not a likable character, but he's sympathetic. I mean, you have to like him. And yet, I do see the wife's point of view in the story as well. But where did you get this voice from?
Well, I got this voice because I was reading a lot of philosophy. Now, I don't really, and the thing I love about philosophy is I don't understand it. So it's like, I feel like I'm 18 again and I'm reading poetry. You know, and the wonderful thing about reading poetry when you're 18 is that you really have no clue what's being said. And it's just this mysterious kind of text. And it's sort of things are sort of buzzing in your eyes, sort of buzzes and sort of flashes of words and I sort of always like that. And so the same thing with philosophy, I sort of read it and I just think, I don't see it anywhere. And I don't really, and what I took away from it in the end, what occurred to me after a while is that, who are these guys? I mean, who are these philosophers? They're people who sit down and take terribly seriously the Enlightenment. You know, we can figure this stuff out. If I sort of think about this hard enough, I will come to a conclusion about it. And then they sort of go into great detail. And lots of philosophy, which is kind of absorbed actually in this book about ethics and the other and all sorts of things. It's all there. But the main thing I got from it was this question of this voice. And ultimately they're sort of comic characters. They're wonderful characters because they are the people we're supposed to be, really. I mean, in theory, we all know from growing up that we're told, you have to try and do the right thing. The churches would tell you, and we'd all be like, yes, yeah, absolutely, I'm going to be good now. But then we just get on with our lives. These people sort of are detained by these questions very intensely, and there are it's a personality type, essentially. And this person who's a lawyer, and I knew lawyers like this as well, who sort of really think that they could figure stuff out logically. And once they've figured something out, then they have to accept what they've figured out. They're sort of intellectually honest about it, so therefore they can't do this anymore. So that's where the voice comes from.
And just one more thing. I mean, I loved the, he has a conscience, and you have this wonderful comic scene where he's running around the hotel trying to give a tip to the mysterious people who clean the room. That almost sounds real, yes.
Yeah, he goes to the first thing that happens when he gets to Dubai is he moves into an apartment which is called a serviced apartment, and it's sort of unnerving because he sort of every day he comes back from his office and there's no sign that he's ever occupied the place, and it's as if a crime has been committed and someone has just some professional has come in to clean up all the evidence, and so he decides to tip the cleaning people, but their job is they're organised as he puts it, like vermin. That's how they're organised. They live in the cracks of the building, and every time you approach them, they sort of scurry off into these other things. And then when he finally tracks them down, they're terrified of him, because if they accept the tip, they're presumably going to be in big trouble. So that's it's a sort of example of this. How do I not do harm? And if you're really preoccupied with that question, then you obviously go slightly crazy.
So the description you gave at the beginning, or in your first part of your reading, where you were talking about the subway Samaritan. Now, it's interesting because it sounds like it really struck you in a way of looking at, even when somebody does good, there are people out there who are willing and find reasons to criticize because everybody somehow or other is a critic. Tell us more about it. What obsessed you about that?
Well, I just love, the first one, I love that word, subway Samaritan, because to my mind, it immediately, by writing about the subway Samaritan, I'm immediately writing about the original Samaritan. And so I don't have to even talk about the original Samaritan anymore, it's covered in this. So it's a way of dramatically involving that story in the novel. And I love this guy, and I remember in the United States, which is such a racist country in many ways. It isn't. In many ways, it's gloriously mixed and diverse. And New York City is fantastic. That's a different place. And he was just sort of, I suppose people were so happy that, they had this hero who'd done this thing. But then, as you said, there was also these crazy people who found it unacceptable that someone could have done a good deed and found ways to sort of attack it. I mean, the violence, and I'm also interested in the violence of the online community. Speaking of community, I mean, this is the other thing, is that we now have neighbours who we don't know, who are prepared to say, right, go online about us. If they I mean, it's a sort of, and we're exposed to the world, and the world's exposed to us online in a way that it never does. I mean, one of the great dilemmas, I think, now, the great problem with the neighbour principle now in the globalised world is, it's all fine and well, in sort of the Holy Land of 2,000 years ago, where you might see a Samaritan once every 3 months. But nowadays, you turn up, 900 people have just died in a shipping accident in the Mediterranean. What's our duty to them? I mean, we're sort of bombarded by these demands, and and the model we have, which is to say, well, we have to come to their aid, is a very difficult model psychologically, because we become overloaded. That model isn't based on a world where the billions of people's misery is suddenly ours to share. And so what we do, typically in response, is we shrink back. We put up our borders, we say no, so we actually withdraw from the principle which we've held until now. So that's come under stress. And I suppose the big question, to which obviously I had zero answer, is how do we, what's the next, what do we do? How do we respond? I mean, we have to come up with a different way to be good now. And it's hard. I don't know what the answer is. Politicians will certainly not have the answer.
And what are you working on now, Joe?
Well, hold on, I'm still resting on my laurels. Well, there are no laurels, but why not rest on the ones which I know?
In the sense, do you plan the next novel when you're still writing the one to be published, or does it come to you in a rush of inspiration? And how did you go from Neverland to the dog, for instance?
Well, I had this one idea, Dubai. That was my one, and now I have an idea for my next one, but I'm still sort of, tootling around. I'm trying to figure out what to. Well, I don't like to have too clear an idea of what I'm doing, because then I'm just kind of stuck with this idea. I sort of want to write something and see what the writing always knows something that you don't, and that's there. And you think, oh, apparently my book is about hex, and so you just write away like that.
And that's something how the dog. We experience it as readers, and I was interested to see what you would excerpt from it, because it's a curious book to read. I don't know if those who've read it have felt this. It's very hard to break from it, to break that narrative, and to know where to stop and where to pick it up.
Well, he starts off at the first page where he talks about his diving and how he loves to dive in Dubai. He loves to be underwater. That's his favourite thing, is being underwater. And it's actually, you're sort of, from that moment on, it's almost as if the reader is underwater. In fact, my original fantasy was to write a whole novel set underwater. Yeah, thank you, I didn't stick with that.
Yeah.
How important is it for you to be based in New York as a writer, or is the location not that significant?
Well, I don't know, that's a good question. I mean, the main thing now, New York gave me one novel. My last one, not this one. Although it helped me with this one too, but this isn't really about New York. And now I feel like I'm not sure I could do another New York novel, because I can only write from the point of view of the person who's the outsider in New York, and I wouldn't be interested, I'm not, But it's important because it's a good place to be a writer, because I teach it. There's lots of colleges around New York, and I have a job at one of them, Bard College. If any of you are interested in spending $50,000 plus a year on your children's higher education, worth every penny. And so I get to, I teach there, but other than that, I don't think it's that. At this point, I could be elsewhere, I think.
And what about the audience and the market for your work? Do you sell better in the States than you do in Europe? Do you sell better than in Britain? Do you know how it breaks down?
Well, I think I do, because the great thing about the United States, and the secret of its economic success, is it's just a massive unified market. So if I make these glasses and people like them, instead of selling them to 1,000 people, I'm selling them to 100,000 people, because that's the way it works there. So you do sell more, I suppose. But I do think that proportionately, to be honest, I'm not quite sure about my sales. I should be more specific about it, I think, but I'm not very good at that. But I do feel that I'm read here. I feel I'm read in Ireland, and I feel I'm read maybe in England as well. And I'm not sure about, and I'm also read in New York. But this book, because it's about Dubai, the Americans are not that interested. They liked the last one because it was about New York. They felt it was about them, even though it wasn't really about them. And this one is less. I think it doesn't quite have that. It's very hard for Americans to, even kind of educated, literate ones, to understand that a novel about somewhere else might be interesting to them. It's harder for them to understand that.
Time for one more question.
You just have to ask Adam from Princeton, so.
All right.
Joyce Carol Oates was on the NPR the other day, and when you said earlier that you like to not know too much about the way you write, and she made this statement. She said she always knows exactly where her book is going and how it ends before she ever writes the first sentence. And no serious writer would ever do otherwise.
Well, she's probably right. Actually, I don't think she's right about the no serious writer bit. But Joyce Carol Oates has written, a lot of books. She's, dare I say, more into quantity than the. But I mean, I wouldn't know. I haven't read it. I can't keep up with her. Every time I think I'm going to read the new Joyce Carol Oates, another one comes out. So by the end, I just think, it's too much. It's too much.
Who do you read of your contemporaries, if anyone?
Well, I don't want to be invidious and sort of pointing. I sort of. I'm not a fantastic reader of contemporary fiction, I have to admit. I do enjoy reading Irish writers, though, mainly because I get sent books to blurb. And so I think, well, it's here, let's read it. I think there was some fantastic fiction people. I mean, there's a young American writer who I like called Ben Lerner. He's a sort of very brilliant and funny sort of writer. And who else is that? I like Colin Tabine, I like kind of all of the Irish writers too. But as I said, I love Paul Muldoon's poetry. I'm sad that I won't be reading any more from Seamus Heaney. I read pretty much most people, and then philosophy, a lot of theory, philosophy, but because I find it baffling and interesting.
Thank you very much indeed, and will you come back and read to us when your next novel is shortlisted for the Man Booker?
It's too good to be, only if it's bad will it be shortlisted, according to your theory.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.